Terrifying Talk. I'm Albert Dadon, your host. This is a new series, and we are starting today with this conversation that I had with three of my Israeli friends on the war with Hamas. Hamas that has sent 3,500 rockets indiscriminately on Israelis' populations, causing the death of children in Sderot and elsewhere. Of course, this is not something that you hear in the media. The media has very poorly covered this war, mostly siding with Hamas. And for the very first time, I think that the coverage in Arabic in Arab countries was more balanced than that in the Western world. I find that extraordinary. I never thought that I would see the day when Arabic countries would be more balanced than the country I live in, which is Australia. It's quite incredible. So, of course, let's start with a few facts. 3,500 rockets were thrown by Hamas onto Israel. It's important that you understand that because the Israelis have responded in self-defense. But what happened is that the Hamas, by sending those rockets, we know that about 1/3 was falling back in Gaza. So they must have sent over 5,000 rockets, if my calculations are correct. And over 1,000 rockets would have fallen back onto their own people. That's devastating. It tells you about people that send, an organization that sends rocket from populated areas. And of course, that is how they always operate. We know, for instance, that Hamas headquarters are underground under the Sifa hospital, which is the main hospital in Gaza. We know, for instance, that they've been bombarding and, by the way, for the first time succeeding to destroy the electricity factory that is a few kilometers north of Gaza in Ashkelon. That electricity factory is the very one that supplies the electricity to Gaza. When the Israelis opened a bridge to actually send medications during the 11-day conflict, they bombarded, that is Hamas, bombarded the humanitarian aid. They're sending rockets indiscriminately. They're absolutely not interested about helping their own people. And in fact, when they were invited by one Israeli soldier who called a building before demolishing it, I heard the conversation where the Hamas official was actually not interested in evacuating. And so the Israeli soldier was beside himself. And the Hamas official answered was, well, that will expose you to the world as to how criminal the Israeli army is. I mean, something I'm paraphrasing, but that's what he said. Crazy stuff. I just cannot understand. Yet, when you look at the Western media, Hamas could have done no wrong. So I'm wondering if you are living in the United States or Australia. Well, let's take the example of the United States, because in Australia, our neighbors, our closest neighbors is the sea. But in America, in the south, for instance, you've got Mexico. So let's imagine that from Tijuana to San Diego, that's about a distance between Gaza and Tel Aviv. If you had some 3,500 rockets sent from Tijuana to San Diego, I'm pretty sure that you would see an American flag flying over Tijuana and the rest of the Mexican city the very next day. When it comes to Australia, I can't give you any such example because New Zealand is our closest neighbor, and all what we can think about in terms of a battle is to have a rugby match. So it's a little bit far-fetched to try even to compare a situation like this with Australia. However, in the Middle East, you can see clearly a double standard. And it's a double standard that is coming from one place, which is the rise of anti-Semitism today in the world. As though Jewish lives don't matter, because the Jews were the very first slaves in history. It's in the Bible. And Jews were the supporters of Black people throughout history to this day. And that has been forgotten. And I say that Jewish lives also do matter. Yet, when you see the so called organizations defending the Black rights, they seem to have forgotten that their first and foremost ally throughout history have been the Jewish people. Israel's reality is that it is fighting a terrorist regime, that is Hamas. It is a terrorist organization that is recognized by Australia as such and most of other countries. So you have to ask yourself the question, why is it that Hamas is capable of sending 3,500 missiles on Israelis' populations, and we get such poor results when it comes to the media coverage of what happened there? So to redress somewhat the narrative, I've invited Professor Boaz Ganor from the IDC University in Herzliya. He's the foremost counter-terrorist of Israel and therefore of the world. All he does, Boaz, is study the behavior of terrorists around the world. I've also invited General Gal Hirsch, who conducted the war against Hezbollah, I should say. In 2006, Israel has enjoyed a quiet time with Hezbollah over the northern border over 15 years now. And I've invited also Lior Schillat, who is the chairman of the Jerusalem Foundation, but one of his other activities is that he's an anti-BDS activist, and he works quietly also around the clock and around the world, and he does an excellent work. I have also asked our friend Alan Howe, who is the executive director of the Dialogue, to join us and to monitor the questions of our audience. And we will see him at the end with some of the questions of the audience and some that he comes up with himself. So without any further ado, let's listen to the conversation I had just this morning with my friends. The question I have is, how did you live through the attack of Hamas during the 11 days in Israel? How was your personal experience? Can I start with you, Boaz?
Sure, with pleasure. Look, we are unfortunately quite familiar with this situation. It's not the first time, and I unfortunately believe also it's not the last time we are facing that. What we see is, of course, an escalation from round to round. The amount of rockets that Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad are launching towards Israel is growing. The explosive head of those missiles are becoming bigger. The range is a longer range, and we have more people that find themselves under concrete threat of being bombed from Gaza Strip. Me personally, unlike the last round, I didn't have any official involvement in these clashes, but my concern was about my kids, about my newborn grandchild, and to see to it, I wasn't worried so much that they would be hurt, but I was even more worried about the psychological damage that being woke up in the middle of the night and running for a shelter would live with them for a long period of time.
And you, Gal?
Well, as my mentor and teacher, Professor Ganor, just mentioned.
Friend, Gal, it's a bigger compliment to be your friend.
That's not a question regarding our friendship, but let me be honored by honoring you. Thanks very much, Boaz. So it's not the first time, just as Boaz mentioned, but this time something special has happened, and we need to see the consequences and what's going to happen in Israel, because this time actually the events of this last operation and this period of time will affect the state of Israel and our nation for the next decades. Now, as all Israelis, my family and I were running to shelters and waiting to hear the sirens. Indeed, for the first time, my grandchild, Yuval, little Yuval, was running with her parents to shelter as well. It means that the next generation needs to run to shelters as well, and next generations will need to be recruited and join the IDF and be a part of wars, unfortunately, in the next decades. That's what terror means. But this time I must tell you that I was much more concerned by what has happened inside Israel and not by what has happened between us and Gaza or between us and Hezbollah, because the Iranian involvement is well known. We will probably discuss it later on, but what has happened inside Israel this time with the Israeli Arabs that created new climate, new reality for many Israelis that traveling along regular roads, you know, visiting regular cities is not safe and not secured anymore. This is something that Israelis never felt in the last, let's say, dozens of years. And this is something that is treated and the feeling is like a betrayal by the Israeli Arabs. And we feel right now that we were stabbed in our back. And this is something that really worries me. I think a lot about that. It has also operational lessons learned for us. Just imagine what's going to happen if our divisions will have to move to the front lines and road number 65 will be closed by Israeli Arab riots, for example. Just that. This is something that we cannot allow. Never. Think about places like next to the Kiryat, to the Israeli military headquarters. Jaffa is not that far from Tel Aviv, as you know. It's a part of Tel Aviv. And if riots will happen in these places again, this is something that won't happen again. The state of Israel will have to change its force buildup, to change its structure, and to change its strategy as well.
Okay, thank you, Gal. I've got lots of questions about what you said, but let's hear, first of all, Lior Schillat.
Okay, so I live in Jerusalem, and funny enough, while the tension in Jerusalem rise until the beginning of the last clashes on May 10th, and of course it was all related to what's happening in Jerusalem, from May 10th on, when there were clashes around Gaza, and as Gal and Boaz mentioned, of course, people all around Israel went to the shelters because of the rockets that were shot by Hamas. Actually, here in Jerusalem, or at least in the western parts of Jerusalem, it was quite normal. The cafes were full, people were doing their life as usual, and even the clashes in the Arab parts of the city were much significantly less than what we experienced during the months of April and May. So clearly, personally, I did not have the experiences that Gal and Boaz mentioned, and not to mention, of course, people that are living in cities like Ashdod, Ashkelon, or Sderot, who suffered daily terror and rocket shooting from the Gaza Strip. I agree with Gal that what was really worrying and the more problematic aspect of what just happened in the last few weeks was what happened inside Israel, meaning the clashes between Arab groups and the police, and in certain places Arab groups and Jewish groups within the cities, the Israeli cities, including the big cities of Lod, Ram, and Acre. And that's definitely something that puts us like a big sign of warning for all of us in the policy field to ask ourselves what's going on next.
Okay, so if I may, if we go back to the beginning of the conflict, I mean, let's have a look firstly at the geopolitical situation prior to the conflict. I know that Israel was about to embark into the largest military exercise in its history, and this was publicized. I think that it's a hard thing for the IDF to keep that a secret these days. But you have immediately after that announcement, you had a breakout with Hamas. Of course, we know what the military exercise was all about. It had nothing to do with terror, that sort of terror with Hamas anyway. It had more to do with the state terror of Iran. And that was a preparation for perhaps something that was going to happen down the track. And lo and behold, you have Hamas, which is one of the proxies of Iran that started this. So would you agree with that analysis? Also, my other question is about the internal politics and what happened also in the with the PA. But let's start with this. Would you agree with this, and can you expand on this, Boaz Ganor?
Sure. Well, I would argue that there is a direct connection to the geopolitics and especially to the Iranian interest and involvement in the region. But before explaining that, let me mention a few reasons that in a synergetic way created this interest and motivation coming from Hamas to start this round of clashes and to launch towards Jerusalem 9 missiles, 9 rockets. One very important reason was, of course, the disappointment from the decision of Abu Mazen to halt and to prevent the elections in the Palestinian Authority. Hamas was preparing themselves. They were quite sure that they are going to win those elections, and they were very disappointed from the decision of Abu Mazen. They wanted to win points within the Palestinian streets in the West Bank, in Jerusalem, and so on and so forth by conducting that. You can add to that many other triggers, Sheikh Jarrah conflict, the events that has to do with Al-Aqsa and the fact that we were in the Ramadan months and the Abdel Qadr night and Jerusalem Day from Israel. It's all synchronized into a very dangerous period of time that had fuel all over. But we should not neglect the Iranian involvement and interest in that event. Now, you were saying about the connection between Hamas and Iran. Let me differ between the connection that Iran has with Palestinian Islamic Jihad and the connection that they have with Hamas. Traditionally, Palestinian Islamic Jihad became, through the years, a proxy of Iran. Almost like Hezbollah, they are the marionette in the hands of Iran. Iran can and does use Palestinian Islamic Jihad to promote their interest in the region, to promote their interest in the Palestinian arena, to promote their interest vis-a-vis Israel. Hamas is a different ballgame. They are enjoying a lot of Iranian support, monetary support, military support, rockets, knowledge, instructions, and so on and so forth. But they keep their independence, unlike Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and they are reluctant to become a full proxy of Iran. I think that one of the interesting outcome of this recent round of clashes with the Palestinians in Gaza was the fact that this time Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas was tightly connected. They opened joint war rooms. They coordinated their attacks against Israel. You could see Hamas spokesperson threatening to launch rockets towards Tel Aviv. And at the end of the day, the one who's launching the rockets is Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and vice versa altogether, which in my view is a proof that Iran was tightly involved in this round of clashes, let alone the efforts to ignite the northern border of Israel by launching rockets in the north toward Israel. This could not have happened, even if it was not launched by Hezbollah itself. This could not happen without Hezbollah at least turning a blind eye, if not even supporting Palestinian extremists in launching those types of attacks. Last but not least, even the doctrine that Hamas and Palestinian Jihad used this time, which was launching batches of rockets, of dozens of rockets, sometimes even more than 100 rockets at once, This definitely was something that they learned from Hezbollah, learned from Iran, trying to challenge the Israeli Iron Dome technology, if not in a better quality of Palestinian rockets, at least with a much bigger amount of quantity of rockets being launched at once towards Israel.
Yes, we've observed that strategy where hundreds of rockets are being sent at once, and that is obviously everyone understood that that was in order to trump the Iron Dome system. That's for sure. But let's walk back a little bit in time, and at the very beginning of the conflict, you still had this very volatile political situation in Israel proper. So you've got Bibi Netanyahu that has not been able to assemble a new government. You have the president of Israel, Rivlin, who's now giving the challengers of Bibi, that is Bennett and the other one is. So there is exactly to those two to actually go and try form a new government, and then suddenly on the very last day of Ramadan, you have one tradition among the Muslims, which is to break Ramadan at the Jaffa Gate. That was refused, and for the first time, I mean, in many years. And then you've got. We know that there were some provocations that were happening in the Har HaBayit, in the Alaska Mosque, and the police, the Israeli police, was ordered to charge. So that's also on the last day of Ramadan. I mean, talking about waving a red flag to a bull. That was not, in my mind, that was not very smart politics. However, if you think further, a couple of steps further, maybe there was an agenda there for Bibi to actually provoke a situation. What do you think of that theory, Lior?
I was hoping that you let Gal answer first. I think that he is more involved in the political arena. So let's do the following. I'll speak a bit more about the events that came before the 10th of May launching of rockets towards Jerusalem, and let Gal answer the conspiracy theory, whether or not this whole was in some way orchestrated by our Prime Minister. We should say that from the beginning of Ramadan, at the end of April, we're observing a rise in tension, and a relatively high rise in tension in Jerusalem that was relatively quiet in the last since 2016, and then in the last, as mentioned, during Ramadan, from the beginning of April, all of a sudden something burst outside. There are a few reasons for that. First of all, psychologically, remember that for the last 15 months, people were stuck in their homes because of COVID-19, and here in Israel, the change from being in a total curfew to almost everything open and people could do almost everything was very swift. So clearly, psychologically, the fact that young people were already all of a sudden allowed in the street had a lot of psychological effect. Then to that, you should add 25% of unemployment in East Jerusalem, when most of the unemployed people in East Jerusalem are below the age of 35, so a lot of young people bored, and funny enough, they're getting paid, meaning the government is taking care of their salaries, so they don't need to make sure that they will earn their living. However, they don't have a workplace, and unemployment is very high here in East Jerusalem because of the crisis in the tourism industry. While the rest of the industry in the city came back, clearly tourism is still in crisis, and most of the hotels and tourism providers are not working. And then, of course, we had to add the Ramadan, which is a month which is very different in its nature than the rest of the year. The night become day, the day become night, and all of that put together in the mixture, and adding to that, of course, the normal volatility of Jerusalem brought to a lot of turmoil here. Just to give you a perspective, thank God there was nobody killed in the clashes between police and East Jerusalemites during the months of Ramadan, but there were 3 people that were murdered in internal fights in East Jerusalem during this time. We had a 21-year-old that was shot in her balcony in the neighborhood of Wadi Jov, a 17-year-old that was stabbed to death by a 13-year-old in the refugee camp of Shuafat, and a person that was stabbed to death on the Temple Mount, on Al-Aqsa Mosque, because of a fight between two families. So clearly, this turmoil that we see only the political aspect of that is much wider than that, and tension in Jerusalem rise and rise and rise. You mentioned the Damascus Gate, the fact that the police decided in a decision that seems to be not very smart to close the Damascus Gate. The Damascus Gate is really the town plaza, the town center of East Jerusalem, and that led to a lot of clashes between police and youngsters that are used to sit there during the long nights of Ramadan. The TikTok attacks by Palestinians on ultra-Orthodox in Jerusalem, humiliating them by slapping them on the light rail or throwing coffee, hot coffee at them, also raised tension on the Jewish side, brought to a lot of attention by Israeli media and in the social media, and later on also to some acts of revenge by Jews against Arabs in Jerusalem city center. And later on, the subject of Sheikh Jarrah, that was adopted by a lot of Palestinian activists as some kind of a front to demonstrate some kind of a trial by Israeli government or Israeli settlers to create some kind of taking over in Arab city. All of that led to the fact.
Can you expand on that, on what happened in it's Shimon HaTzadik? That's the place, right? So yeah, what happened there exactly?
So Shimon HaTzadik is an issue that is being dealt for the last 30 years. We're talking about two Jewish neighborhoods that were built in the outskirts of the Palestinian neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah in the 19th century, and were evacuated in 1948 because of the war, the 1948 war, our war of independence. The land owned by Jews was then taken by the Jordanian authorities, and the houses there, those that were built and others that the Jordanian government built, were given to Palestinian refugees. In 1967, when Israel annexed East Jerusalem, the previous owners, the Jewish owners of the houses of these neighborhoods, reclaimed their right to get their houses, and some kind of a compromise in the court, it was decided that those houses would stay would be owned again by the Jewish owners, but the Palestinian residents will pay them rent, and they will be declared some kind of a guarded owners, or I don't know the English terms, but they would keep their rights to live in the place. What happened was that the renters, the Palestinian renters, just stopped paying rent, and during the 90s, the owners of those compounds started asking the courts to evacuate them. And in May, as part of this perfect storm that I just described, the court was supposed to discuss, to have a session about evacuating a large portion of those Palestinian families from their homes in this Shimon HaTzadik / Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood. If that's not enough, then two members of Knesset, one from the extreme left and one from the extreme right, decided to use this opportunity, and they were very involved in the demonstrations there. One is Ofer Kassif from Reshima Mishutefet, from the Joint Arab List, and the other one is Itamar Ben-Gvir from Otzma Yehudit, sorry. So both of them were very involved there, and clearly that also added to the tension around it. Now, what people did not notice is there was a very focused social media campaign to bring more and more Arab supporters to Sheikh Jarrah, and they every night those clashes around these houses in the last week of May. And at a certain point, these clashes also led to a clash in Al-Aqsa Mosque. And as we, the Jerusalem Institute, always say, the moment that there are clashes in Al-Aqsa Mosque, you cannot stop the fire. And that's what eventually led to everything. But we see here the sequence that started from all the events that I spoke about, and then Damascus Gate, then Sheikh Jarrah, and eventually the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and then the shooting of the rockets towards Jerusalem by Hamas.
Yeah, it was really the manufacturing of a perfect storm, it seems. So Gal, talking about that conspiracy theory that we heard quite a bit about, what do you say? I mean, was that just the circumstances that couldn't be helped? I mean, when you are provoked at the Al-Aqsa Mosque if you were the chief of police, which I know you nearly became the chief of police, you were in fact appointed chief of police of Israel, and then for some circumstances that did not eventuate. But if you were the chief of police, would you have acted in the same way? Would you have attacked the Al-Aqsa Mosque?
Well, so
on
many
the last day of
times
Rabbana?
So many times I've been asked in the last 3 weeks, what could happen if I was the chief of Israeli police?
There you go, one more time from me.
And actually there is a chief of Israeli police, and we all need to pray for his success. And regarding your question about is it a possibility? Is it possible that Prime Minister Netanyahu arranged all this perfect storm and successfully created war that intercepted another option of government, that changed government? Well, you know, I am, as known, and this is transparency, this forum, so for all our audience, yes, I am a Likud member. I'm not that politician, Lior, not yet. I'm very young in politics, but officially I'm a Likud member. This is my ideological house, and I appreciate Prime Minister Netanyahu. But in order to create such perfect storm, you need to be much more than supercomputer. And with all my appreciation to Prime Minister Netanyahu, I think that we much more can count on the Iranian regime that he will initiate such a snowball, such avalanche as has happened in Israel in the last 3 weeks. Because it was, just as Boaz mentioned, it was clear when you looked at the calendar and you saw that the Ramadan, the Laylat al-Qadr, and the Jerusalem Day, and all this political situation in Israel, everything is happening in the same day. So actually, it has been created already. And this is just what we call course of history. It is not something else. And when I've been asked in one of the TV programs, the same question you were asking, Albert, is it possible that Prime Minister Netanyahu arranged it? I just mentioned the famous book of Edward Kennan about the art of the possible, about politics. The art of possible means also that it is possible that people will speak their mind, and sometimes they speak nonsense. So it is possible that it is nonsense that Prime Minister Netanyahu arranged these events. I think that the political situation in Israel, this type of turbulency, it is a perfect feeling for the Iranian regime to understand that, unfortunately, and I feel terrible to say so, that Israel also became almost a UGA, ungoverned area. And as we know their strategy, they used to enter immediately and interfere into any UGA. It has happened in Gaza. They've successfully made a coup in Gaza and created Hamastan out of the Palestinian Authority. They entered into Lebanon and took Hezbollah as a young militia of the Shiite minority and created it an Iranian army deployed on the borders of Israel. They used the civil war in Syria after the Arab Spring or the Middle East upheaval and tried to build there an Iranian army. They used the civil war in Yemen to support the Houthis. They used the turbulence in Iraq to build there the Hezbollah army. So why won't they try and enjoy what is happening in Israel when there is no real government in the last 2 years, and when the Israeli Arabs, and this is a point, when the Israeli Arabs are coming that close to be in an Israeli government for the first time in history. And we were so close to create this historical event that I'm supporting as a part of the right side of the Israeli politics. I thought that it is great that the Israeli Arabs will be really involved in an Israeli government. They are 20% of our citizens. And they actually, by bringing the spark to these buckets of explosives, to this turbulent period of time, to this religion period of time of the Ramadan, Laylat al-Qadr, Jerusalem Day, etc., by pushing from here and from there and using all the interests around, they successfully intercepted the option that Israeli Arabs will be a part of Israeli government. Now, another story issued by your permission, Albert, that I'd like to mention is regarding the involvement of Hezbollah, of Iranian militias, Israeli Arabs, and Palestinians of Al-Tanzim, which is the militias of Abu Mazen, and others around us in this celebration, so-called. This is actually, maybe Boaz will agree with me, this is actually a promo for the next war. And this is actually fulfilling the dreams of Qasem Soleimani, that wanted very much to make sure that Israel will be surrounded by so many forces directed by Tehran. And for the first time, Qasem Soleimani, that is not with us, thanks, we did it. He is not with us anymore, but his dream came true. Israel was and is surrounded by enemies directed, financed, equipped, trained by Tehran. And for the first time, we saw how a war could look like when we have hints of rockets from Lebanon, armed UAV from Iran, via Syria, rockets from Syria, riots in the Jordanian-Israeli border, riots with live weapons, live ammunition in Judea and Samaria, Israeli Arabs in armed riots inside Israel, and Gaza Strip as Hamastan is firing Israel for more than 4,000 rockets, more than in all 2006 war and in protective edge operation.
Yes, so there is a lot to unpack there, because effectively it will be interesting to analyze what could happen if there was an all-out war with Iran. But let's walk back a little bit. You know, I think Immanuel Kant is the one who said that the only way we have to ameliorate ourselves is by self-criticism. That's the best tool that we have. So I hear the defense about Bibi Netanyahu and that he was not able to organize such a perfect storm all by himself. I get that, but restrain is part of a strategy. You're a chess player, you're a strategist yourself, Gal, and you know what that means. So when you have a provocation by Arabs in the last day of Ramadan, is it smart to respond, or is it smarter to restrain? Why is it that the most intelligent, in inverted comma, country in the world is so dumb when it comes to simple strategies like this?
Well, I'll just answer that very shortly. I think that there are red lines that any nation must draw. And I'm afraid that we mistakenly agreed to ceasefire or to stop the fire during this last operation. I think that when your capital is under rockets fire, when the Israeli Arabs are actually burning everything inside Israel, when Hezbollah is opening fire from the north, Iran is
Wait. I think you're misunderstanding my question. I've gone back to Harabite and the Jaffa Gate. I'm not talking about responding to Hamas rocket. Obviously, you have to respond. I'm talking about a very simple provocation in the last day of Ramadan. How is it that you respond in such a force when all you had to do is to let the storm pass?
Well, I think that it did not start with the Temple Mount events, and nor in Damascus Gate. It started before. If you are looking for the white ball that hit all the other balls in the billiard table,
my dear friend, I'm not looking at anything. I'm just looking at those two events. If you look at them in isolation, and if you are an Israeli Arab living in a village, you would be outraged that let's say as a Jew, if you were attacked in that fashion at the Eve of Yom Kippur in Kol Nidre, you would have every right to be enraged.
Albert, I think we just this time we just do not share the same point of view.
Please intervene for one moment. Going back to the questions that you have posed to Gal, it seems to me that there are three explanatory alternative options. The first one is that Bibi is a supercomputer, which I don't rule out that option. He is some kind of a supercomputer in my view. The second option is that God is Jewish and he is a Likud voter. I don't rule out this option as well, by the way. And the third one is that the third one is that we see an accumulative stupid reactions from Israeli decision makers, and frankly, I buy this more than the first two altogether. And I tend to agree with you that there were few mistakes. Some of them were even intentional, not necessarily by the Israeli government. I refer to Ben Gvir decisions to be involved in Sheikh Jarrah at that voter-related time and area. I do agree with you that the decision of the Israeli police to storm into the mosque was a huge mistake, especially because there was no risk to the Jews that was praying at the Wailing Wall at the same time. The decision to stop the buses of the Israeli Arabs on the way to Al-Aqsa. Yes, I say that in a retrospective point of view, and it's easier to do it in a retrospective point of view. But when you look at it, yes, those contributed to the deterioration of the situation. Frankly, I'm not sure that Hamas would refrain from starting this escalation if we would not done those specific mistakes. I think he had an intention to start around with Israel. It suits his interest. It definitely suits Iran interest at that time. So there is not necessarily a contradiction between those two options.
Definitely. I don't think that anything would have stopped Hamas. They had an agenda, and that was more based, I think, on geopolitics. But now let's analyze the outcome of the war. Firstly, Gal, I'd like to ask you that question. How do you analyze the military operation? Was it to your satisfaction? Do you have any, because when you were in charge in 2006 of the Lebanon war in the north, you went in with your guys and you inflicted such damage to Hezbollah that to this day Hezbollah has not attacked Israel because they know what can happen when Israel really unleashes its power. In this instance, I don't believe Israel has unleashed their power. I think in the instance of Gaza, Israel has shown a lot of restraint. But do you think that that's the way to inflict any damage to Gaza, to Hamas? Don't you think that Hamas will rebuild very quickly and will start again?
Well, I would like to try and frame the two types of strikes Israel Defense Forces use in the last decades. One type of strike is a fire strike, and the other one is the dismantling strike. Dismantling strike is, for example, defensive shield operation. March 2002, the Israel Defense Forces put a blanket on a bonfire and brought all its special forces and 5 divisions, including reserve divisions, and actually retook the Judea and Samaria area from the Palestinian authorities' forces and from the terror organizations. That brought to us actually more than 22 years of silence in this region, and today we have full dominancy of Judea and Samaria area, not like we do not have in Gaza Strip, because there we did not make defensive shield operation a type of dismantling strike. Same as happened, as you just mentioned, Albert, in 2006, when the directive was to parallel strike by offensive ground forces maneuver made mainly by my 91st Division in the southern part of Lebanon, actually destroying the Dahia, which is the governing quarter of Beirut of Hezbollah, by the Israeli Air Force, and unique special forces operations parallel. That made a strike that actually threatened Hezbollah, and Nasrallah actually told in the second day that if he knew that the Israelis will behave this way, he would never kidnap 2 Israeli soldiers. That actually was the casus belli for that war. And these dismantling operations with boots on the ground brought us 15 years of silence and full deterrence in the northern border, because they understand the price. The other type of strikes, and the last one was just that type of, is like Operation Accountability in 2006, Operation Grapes of Wrath in Lebanon, Protective Edge Operation, Cast Lead Operation, all in Gaza Strip. It means that we actually buy time. Now, the differences between this type of strikes is that you buy few years time when you use fire strikes, and you change reality by boots on the ground when you are going into a dismantling strike. Now, the state of Israel actually directed the Israel Defense Forces this time not to march inside and not to dismantle Hamas. So again, and this time we must say that the Israel Defense Forces has performed, I won't say perfectly, but it was very, very impressive, because look at the minimal collateral damage, look at the selective type of maneuvering and fire usage, look at the defense maneuver. All the Gaza division actually blocked any type of success from Hamas trials. Actually, they did not succeed to infiltrate by a tunnel. They never succeeded to use their SEALs. They could not use their autonomous submarines. They could not use their armed UAVs. They did not succeed almost completely even with the rockets, because we have a multi-layer Iron Dome, David Sling, and Arrow 1 and Arrow 3. And actually, the defense maneuver by the IDF was very, very close to perfect. But I do not like the result, because it was not a dismantling maneuver. It was a fire strike that will buy us 2, 3, 4, 5 years, and that's it. And there will be another one. That's it.
Why do you think that Bibi did not go for the dismantling strategy? It was up to him, after all.
Mainly, I believe because Prime Minister Netanyahu's strategy, and even I would say grand strategy, along his tenure of being the leader of Israel, was always not to go on war. Look at his behavior along the years. He never took Israel into dismantling maneuver, never. He's working perfectly with special forces, with secret services, with war between wars. He just do not want to take Israel into war, and he believes that, you know, it is much discussed in Israel, the picture of victory. You know this terminology? What is our Iwo Jima, the paratroopers in the Western Wall, you know, all these photos that finish wars, the statues of Saddam Hussein falling in Baghdad main square. Actually, I believe that Prime Minister Netanyahu believes that the picture of victory is how the state of Israel is look like in every day. It is not about what is happening in the end of a war or an operation. I believe that any Palestinian in Gaza or Judea and Samaria, or any citizen, civilian in the Arab countries around us would like very much to have a blue identity card and be a citizen of Israel, because of medical services, because of prosperity, because of vaccinations, because of everything. And this is the real picture. And as someone said, it is about the economy. That's it.
Okay, so thank you, Gal. I have Alan Howe. Alan, are you here? Alan? Okay, so I don't know what happened to our friend Alan. He was here to gather all the questions, and he has disappeared. Maybe we'll reconnect in a moment. What you said, Gal, before about if the rockets were to come in a coordinated fashion between the north, from the Lebanon, from Iran, and so on, given that you have observed some of the failures in Israel, because some rockets did go and fell on cities, and you had, I believe, some 25 people that died, unfortunately, during this war. And can you depict to me what would it be like if suddenly there was a conflict with Iran? How would that work out? Isn't that something that, well, I'll let you answer that question first before I ask you the second one.
I think that when ICT, the Institute for Counterterrorism, actually that Boaz established and managed, has identified the danger of a fire strike from Hezbollah, from Iran, from Gaza, and from other places parallel. And right now there is a unique project in one city in Israel, the city of Herzliya, to try and organize the city to better cope with such circumstances. And maybe Boaz will elaborate on this. Just think what's going to happen in Israel when not 4,000 rockets will be launched towards Israel, but let's say only 50,000 rockets, okay, in 7 days, not all the 120,000 rockets. And of course, our multi-layer system won't be able to intercept them all because we will have to protect our main areas of protections that are important for Air Force bases, strategic facilities, and mass populated areas specifically, etc. So the damage will be huge, terrible, and no one will be able to move from north to south or south to north because all Israel is covered by actually this type of weapon. So I let Boaz describe the meanings of all that because he's leading this specific project. And Boaz, you need to know that my daughter, which is one of your students, is now sitting in Herzliya District Council to prepare this solution that you are working with.
Thank you, Gal, for alluding to this specific project. And I can say that the fruit that the Hirsch family created is only getting better from generation to generation. Now, thank you for alluding for that project. And Albert, I think it's important to mention that the ICT is working for the last 2 years in trying to predict what would be the nature of this war, Third Lebanon War or overall war in the region, if and when it will happen. And you know, you were asking me what was my feeling. That was the first question that you posed to me today. What was my feeling when the campaign started with Gaza? And my wife was so, she asked me, how come you are that calm and not really getting into any fears and anxiety? I said, this is chicken feed compared to the real thing. And the real thing would be the war with Hezbollah, with Iran, and practically the whole region. First of all, in that war that I'm describing here, we would not have the luxury of secluding one border. With a few exceptions, we had a war with Gaza. We had a problem inside Israel. We had some problems on the borders, but other borders didn't ignite. In the war with Gaza, I tend to believe that the whole region will be ignited as an outcome of that. The second thing, as Gal was mentioning, is the quantity. Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad as an arsenal today, or had before the recent operation, an arsenal of about 20,000 rockets that cover approximately half of the territory of Israel. Hezbollah has an arsenal of 200,000 rockets and missiles, some of them guided, some of them with huge explosive heads, and many of them are accurate, that cover the whole territory of Israel. If we have witnessed in the last 2 weeks the worst situation ever of launching 4,000 rockets towards Israel in 11 days, this is the amount of rockets that we expect that will be launched to Israel on a daily basis. 4,000 rockets, somewhere between 3,000 to 4,000 rockets on a daily basis, and multiple that in the number of days that we will need in order to win the war, that we would win against Hezbollah at the end of the day. And if you understand those quantities, you understand that for Iran and Hezbollah, this was, I want to say, a dry drill, this last event in Gaza. But it was not dry drill, it was wet drill, which they learned all of the above. And let me finalize with one message, which I think it's a very important message. I never heard it before, and I want to express it. You know, we have been criticized by many Israeli criticizers to be so-called behaving in an unproportional manner, which is, of course, ridiculous. As Gal was mentioning, how cautious Israel was with so many procedures, unprecedented procedures of guarding the lives of the citizens of our enemies, which are being used as human shields by the terrorists themselves, by Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad themselves. This is ridiculous. But you know how it happened that we could have been so cautious in our military behavior? It happened, Alan, if you can mute yourself, it would be better for us. So we could have been that cautious and that proportional in our behavior because one reason and one reason only, because our technological hegemony, because of Iron Dome system, because in those 4,000 rockets that have been launched to us, only few of them really created casualties and damage within Israel. Hezbollah should understand that the Iron Dome protected the Israeli citizens' life, but at the same time, the Iron Dome protected the lives of the Palestinian citizens. This is the statement that needs to be clarified. The Iron Dome protects the lives of the Palestinian citizens no less than it protects the lives of the Israeli citizens. And with the amount of the rockets that Hamas is planning to launch toward Israel, the Iron Dome probably would not protect the lives of the Lebanese citizens, because when we will have hundreds of thousands of casualties in Israel, we would not have the luxury to be so cautious and so proportional in our military activity against military facilities which are embedded within the civilian society, as Hezbollah is doing in Lebanon, as Hamas is doing in Gaza.
Actually, I would like just, Boaz, sorry for interrupting, just want to explain exactly, operationally, what does it mean? Just try to imagine what could happen if this time in the last operation in Gaza, Israel did not have the Iron Dome system, just as we did not have the Iron Dome system in 2006. And the result was that actually the Israel Defense Forces had to maneuver inside Lebanon in order to remove the threat from the southern part of Lebanon, and mainly to remove the short-range Katyushas and rockets from the southern part of Lebanon. Now, the Israeli Air Force actually dismantled the long-range rockets in the northern part of Lebanon, so we had to deal mainly with the medium size. Now, if we did not have Iron Dome, Israel had to occupy Gaza Strip. Not other way. We could not, and that's what's going to happen inside Lebanon. It means actually, and we claim it, we declare it, we say so on every stage. Next war in Lebanon, Israel will have to maneuver fast, aggressively, and actually destroy Lebanon, the state, which is hosting Hezbollah, and destroy Hezbollah completely. And it may happen not only in Lebanon, because today they are in Syria as well. And this is why next northern war will be very, very, very aggressive, mainly because we will not be able to be Israel Defense Forces, because we will not be able to defend Israel from 200,000 rockets. The only way to defend ourselves will be by maneuvering and by occupying Lebanon, all of it, in order to remove the threat.
So, maybe you are aware that throughout this war, we've seen a rise of anti-Semitism throughout the world that I have never seen before. I think that the anti-Israel sentiment, which we are all very familiar with, was this time echoed by every media. I mean, there's very few and far between the people that stood up to defend the state of Israel. And I want to ask Alan Howe, Alan, our executive director, and a journalist himself, to tell us what he thought about the coverage of the war here in Australia, and then let him ask you also some questions. Alan, welcome. You had some technical difficulties, my friend, but you are here with us now.
I did. Thank you, Albert. I have a virus, and I've been fighting that, but obviously my computers are sharing it with me. A couple of things. Unlike any other conflict in the last 20 years, Israel lost the PR war this time. And it did so, I think, because there were such complexities in the beginning of the dispute about those Israeli-owned family properties in what's called East Jerusalem. Now, I'd like to ask two questions. They're to everybody, but particularly, I think, Gal and Boaz. First off, the simple question, how can we help the Palestinians in their fight against Hamas? Because if the West and Israel can't help them win that battle, then it's all lost. It's lost to Hamas forever. That's number one. Number two is I'm intrigued by the concept of East Jerusalem. And I'm not too sure there's ever been a physical description of anywhere in Jerusalem called East Jerusalem. But it's used by Israel's enemies as if the Israelis were intruders on East Jerusalem. Now, a lot of what they call East Jerusalem, if you look at a map, it's North Jerusalem. But I think what's happening is that Israel and the West enemies have been able to characterize their dispute with Israel into a fight about an East Jerusalem that really doesn't exist. So two things. The most important question is, how can Israel and the West help Palestinians defeat Hamas, fight Hamas, or at least challenge it, number one. And number two, this whole thing about East Jerusalem, it's a house of cards, and it's set up to advantage one group alone, is it not?
Who would like to answer that?
I'll start with your permission. I think that Lior would want to refer also to
absolutely.
the
Lior definitely.
part. Let me say that Israel, unfortunately, is experienced with failures in trying to advise our enemies how they should behave in their internal affairs. Think about Lebanon, Bashir Gemayel event after the first Lebanon war, and so on and so forth. So I would be very reluctant to be involved in Palestinian politics, trying to influence to that way or to the other way. But I think that your question, Alan, has a lot of merit. And my recommendation would have been to anyone that might listen to me, and those are people are becoming fewer and fewer altogether. It's only Albert that is still listening to me and his friends. My recommendation would have been, don't help Hezbollah. Israel, please don't help Hezbollah. That would be the biggest achievement that we can have. Don't let Hezbollah get money from Qatar. Don't let suitcases of dollars get into Gaza and being spent by Hamas activists in Gaza. Prevent anything you can from Hamas, not from the Gazans. Any humanitarian effort that you do, and we do a lot in supporting Gaza, do it in other tracks, not via Hamas altogether. That might do the trick altogether. Let me mention one other thing, and this is maybe the only thing that I don't see eye to eye with Gal that he mentioned before. I'm quite satisfied with the ceasefire that we have reached, and I'll tell you why. Gal perfectly explained that those types of wars between wars, rounds in Gaza, might be ended in one of the two options, either decisive victory or some kind of a ceasefire and a settlement. Those are the two options. Until today, as Gal was mentioning, we never reached the decisive victory, first and foremost because the government never told the army to conduct it. And decisive victory could be conducted by two options, either, as Gal was mentioning, by boots on the ground, reoccupying Gaza, which will have a huge toll in lives of the Palestinians and probably Israeli soldiers as well, or carpet bombing style Russia in Syria or Iran in Syria and so on and so forth. And this is against any moral standards that Israel is holding and any Western democracy is holding altogether. This is the reason why Israel until now didn't reach or even try to achieve a decisive victory. All those previous rounds ended with settled ceasefires with specific settlements, conditions that accompanied with it. Why am I satisfied with this ceasefire? Is because there was no settlement. This was a ceasefire that in a way was imposed on Hamas by Israel or by the international community without any conditions. That's a great start for what we have discussed before. That's a great start to see to it that now the rehabilitation of Gaza will not be conducted through Hamas and will not reinforce and give a greater power to Hamas in Gaza and in the Palestinian arena.
Lior, would you like to answer Alan about East Jerusalem?
Sure, of course. So first of all, it is important to say that the term East Jerusalem is being used in dual meaning. Meaning when people say East Jerusalem, some of them speak only about the Arab neighborhoods of Jerusalem with 360,000 people, but some of them are referring to the entire 70 square kilometers that were annexed by Israel in June 1967 after the Six-Day War. And in this area, in addition to the 360,000 Palestinians, there are another almost 250,000 Jews, 230,000 Jews. In fact, this entire area that was annexed to Jerusalem in 67, if it was a separated city for itself without West Jerusalem, it would have been Israel's largest city. It's bigger than West Jerusalem. It's bigger than Tel Aviv. It has the population 3 times of Haifa. meaning we're talking about a very vast area, very big area. 18% of the total Arab population of Israel, and almost 6% of the total population of Israel, Jews and Arab together, live in East Jerusalem. And this year, actually before the events of the Ramadan month, saw some kind of a very good point in the relations between the state of Israel and East Jerusalem, because for the first time since 1967, the Israeli government actually made a decision to invest heavily in both infrastructure and culture and society in East Jerusalem, a 2 billion shekel investment package that was passed by the government in 2016. During COVID, for the first time, we saw a heavily good intervention, positive intervention by the Jerusalem municipality in what's happening in East Jerusalem. So, in fact, when I spoke before about the perfect storm, we need to remember that in the background, we have a very significant campaign of investment by the Israeli government in the Arab neighborhoods of East Jerusalem. And we see more and more influence of this intervention, of this investment on what's happening in East Jerusalem. Clearly, and this is a very important point, when we see a big government investment, and when we add to that the moving of a society from poverty into the middle class, actually it would also result with some kind of a social turmoil. Okay, it's a bit against the instinct to think about it, but that's actually what's happening. People have more money, they have more free time, they're looking more for social for their social rights. There is also more and more gaps, and those gaps, social gaps within the Arab society, those gaps also create tension and unrest. So we are in some kind of a social situation in East Jerusalem that is definitely a good ground for all kinds of unrest. Ironically, just because the Israeli government for the first time decided to heavily invest in what's happening in East Jerusalem. Now, we need to remember when we talk about Sheikh Jarrah that at the end, Sheikh Jarrah is one neighborhood, relatively small, out of as I mentioned, 360,000 people, not city, but an area in Jerusalem. And that's also something to take into consideration. You cannot judge what's happening in East Jerusalem only according to what's happening in Sheikh Jarrah.
And Lior, are you happy with the outcome of the war?
Is that a question directed to me?
To yourself, yes, because I had the opinion of Gal and Boaz, but I haven't heard your opinion.
Well, first of all, I guess like everyone, I would have preferred not to be asked this question, in the sense that wars are not the kind of things that we should accept. I do think that at a certain point, and this is not something that we can avoid, Israel would have to go into some kind of a more decisive move towards Hamas, not necessarily a physical move. It could also be a diplomatic one, but Israel should decide what is its clear interest when it comes to Gaza, and then try to find a way to do it. Otherwise, as Gal mentioned before, we need to expect every few years to have one of those rounds, and clearly this is not something that is positive, although I'll go back to Jerusalem. We always say that in Jerusalem, the main problem is that the policy is that there is no policy. And once the Israeli government would have policy, no matter what would this policy be, it will be much easier to solve some of the main challenges of Jerusalem. So I'm saying exactly the same about Hamas. It is not clear what is the policy of Israel towards Hamas. It is not clear what are the clear goals that the Israeli government had put when it comes to its relations with Hamas. And I think that the first step in order to solve this problem is for the Israeli government to say, do we want to eradicate them? Do we want to tolerate them? Do we want to empower them? Because some people would say that the Israeli policy until now was to empower Hamas. What is the clear Israeli policy? And once there will be a clear Israeli policy, I think next step will be much easier to achieve, or relatively easier to achieve.
Okay, Alan, do you have any other comments or question?
I do have one last question, Albert, and I wonder if Gal could help us with this. Is it possible at all for Israel to make sure that all the goods and economic benefit of the efforts to rebuild Gaza are directed only towards that, and they're not a Trojan horse for materials and finance to assist, for instance, more tunneling?
Well, first, if you don't mind, Alan, I'd like to try and suggest something regarding your previous question, regarding how to help Palestinians help themselves. And what I'd like to suggest is, since I do not think really that Hamas has actually logical sense of behavior, it is their own logic behavior, and they are directed by the Ayatollahs directly and indirectly, and they won't go into Singapore-like plan for Gaza Strip. I think that what can help a lot is money, and a lot of money, but it means actually to internationalize the Gaza problem. It means that actually if the international community will suggest, let's say, 25-30% of people from Gaza to depart Gaza and come and learn and live in the other parts of the world, you immediately dry a big portion of the swamp of terrorism from the Middle East, which is the living spring of terrorism. So 25-30% of the people will be hosted in the rest of the world, and the others will enjoy international programs. When Egypt, Turkey, all these people that so care about Gaza will be a part with Israel, with the Emirates, with maybe Qatar, with United States of America as the leader of it, with the European community, all of them together will Singaporeize Gaza. Actually, probably we will have million people in Gaza and not 2.2 millions. Million and a half people in Gaza, and Gaza will be able to be a successful and prosperous place. Now, it means grand strategy, and it means economy, and it means pressure by the rest of the world, and it means that Biden's administration won't sign an agreement with Iran without solving Gaza problem, or without taking out the detonator of Iran from the terror alignment around Israel, what they did very successfully by Quds Force headed by Soleimani. So it means grand strategy. Biden's administration won't deal only with nuclear program and enrichment of uranium. It means that actually we will deal with terrorism. It means we will deal with Gaza. It means we will deal with the militias and others. It means that when our Prime Minister Netanyahu is fighting and struggling, and rumors say that even the Israeli Mossad and special forces are fighting against the nuclear program, according to the media, it means that we will not fight only against this problem, but we will fight against the symptom and the birth nest of terrorism in the Middle East. And right now, Gaza became an infrastructure for that. Okay, so this is it was important for me to suggest this issue, because 2.2 million people in such narrowest place, it's not a big problem for the international community to deal with. It can be solved very, very fast even. Okay, so can you help me with your question, Alan? Again, I was focused in.
Yes, Gal. I was asking to what degree Israel and the West can guarantee that whatever assistance, physical and financial, that goes to rebuilding parts of Gaza after this conflict and previous ones will be directed to that cause and not, be funneled into a Trojan horse for Hamas.
So actually, I started to elaborate on your question actually by telling that there will be an international force agreed by Israel. It means not Turkish force and not Iranian force. It means Italians, nice people that eat pasta, people that will come from other places in the world, people that we can trust their culture. They will come and monitor everything inside Gaza in order to reconstruct Gaza and to let people live there with prosperity, healthy, regular lives. Without all that, believe me, 30-35% of any goods that will go into Gaza will go again to develop new type of rockets, new type of tunnels, building again or rebuilding the so-called metro of Gaza, the underground system of Gaza. That's their DNA, they are terror organization, terror army. They do not know how to do other things. They do not know how to develop high-tech industry. what they know is actually Dar al-Islam, Dar al-Kharb. I'm speaking now Arabic. Yes, they know jihad. And that's what they will do if they won't be under international pressure that will be imposed on Iran as well as their patron. This is actually very important. And Albert, by your permission, I'd like to elaborate about an interesting conversation I had during this operation with our mutual friend that you introduced to me. This is the author, the Egyptian author, Tarek Hegi.
Yes.
And Tarek Hegi, which is a well-known Egyptian author, he wrote more than 50 books and he's a very famous person. He published a piece during this war with Gaza, and he said, mainly just before the end of the war, when there was also the hint of ceasefire, he actually published this quote. In 2006, Lebanon has been destroyed and Hezbollah was badly hit by Israel, and they declared a divine victory. In 2021, Gaza was destroyed and Hamas was badly hit by the Israel Defense Forces, and Haniya, the leader of Hamas, declared a divine victory. And he said, I'm not surprised by this mindset by the Arabs, and he himself is an Arab. So I made the phone call and I asked him, Tarek, how can you explain this? Let me explain this to the Israeli public, because this war, my unit has not been recruited. So I found myself in the TV programs always explaining to the Israeli public what's going on. So I wanted to explain Tarek's mindset. And he told me, look, nomad societies like Palestinians, like Bedouins, like in Gaza, like in even a part of Lebanon, this type of societies does not have too many assets. They only have words. And as it is well known, there is no taxes on words. So that's what I explained to the people of Israel.